All right. And then I'm going to ask everybody to make sure you've, it looks like everybody has muted. And then I'll hand it over to Sheila to take over, and then we'll ask Jennifer to share her screen. And it, great. So here you go, Sheila. I'm going to change my
Okay. Hopefully my internet will be okay, because I share the same internet that Amy does. So anyway, Jennifer has quite a history of getting involved in super interesting projects. As an undergraduate at the University of Toronto, her honor thesis looked at mammal abundance and diversity within an active Guianese logging concession, not your usual honors project. This involved setting up cameras and recording mammal tracking along the logging roads. She's able to estimate mammal abundance and diversity, and was even able to identify resident jaguars by their spotting patterns. Pretty amazing. For her master's in forest conservation at the University of Toronto, she studied the biocontrol of dog strangling vine. For anyone who tuned in last night to Friends of the Salmon River, their Zoom presentation, and Amanda Tracy talking about the invasive Asian mice, you'll definitely recognize the importance, economic and environmental havoc that these invasives can cause. So Jennifer explored the feasibility of introducing moth species at different stages in the life cycle, and developed a device for wide-scale application for management procedures. So we might want to ask her a few questions at the end of the question period, since dog strangling is kind of a problem here in the county. Jennifer's also worked on a team for a project called Conference of the Future to look into decreasing carbon footprint and environmental impacts of in-person events. So this is perfect for you, Jennifer, that we're all meeting this way. Tonight, though, we're going to be focusing on her work about the eastern wild turkey in Ontario. She is currently a PhD student at Trent University in Dr. Jeff Bowman's laboratory. Wild turkeys were introduced into, well, they weren't introduced, they were hunted to extinction first in Ontario in the early 1900s, but then they were reintroduced here in the 1980s. Because the Ontario population has grown and changed rapidly, understanding how many individuals there are and where they're distributed is necessary to ensure the long-term persistence of the species in the province. So Jennifer's research is keyed into the behavior and social structure of wild turkey populations and what influences nesting success. We're all eager to hear how she does this. So with no further ado, I'll turn it over to Jennifer to tell us about her studies and what she's discovered. Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'll just go ahead and share my screen here. Okay. Can everyone see my screen okay and hear me okay?
Yes, Jennifer, thanks. It's Amy.
Okay, wonderful, great. Okay, so yeah, so as Sheila said, I study wild turkeys now at Trent University. And so the talk that I'm going to give you tonight is called Wild Turkeys, A Year in the Life. And so I'm going to talk about sort of how turkey behavior changes with the seasons, and then how, as a turkey researcher, we need to sort of change our the methods that we use to study turkeys with the seasons as well, based on their behavior. And so I like to start this talk with a very brief history of wild turkeys in Ontario. As Sheila said, they were hunted to extinction in the early 1900s. And so the term we use for this is extirpated. So just hunted to extinction in sort of one region. And it was this way where there were no turkeys in Ontario for quite some time until 1984, so sort of the mid 1980s, when wildlife managers came together and decided that it would be worth a try to reintroduce this species. And they did so by swapping wildlife with several different states in the US. So we traded species that we perceived to have an abundance of, so species like moose and river otter, for a handful. So we started with 274 wild turkeys. So we swapped with the states listed in the bottom right here. So Missouri, Iowa, Michigan, regions that are sort of similar in terms of climate. And so we reintroduced 274 individuals in the beginning. And then there were subsequent reintroductions and sort of trap and transfer efforts around the province, resulting in 4,400 individuals total being reintroduced and kind of shuffled around to different places. And then if we fast forward to 2007, this is when the most recent sort of population estimate was published. And this is published in Ontario's Wild Turkey Management Plan. So you can sort of go online and find that management plan. It's publicly available. And the estimate published in the plan was 70,000 individuals. But this was really a rough estimate. This wasn't sort of based on any empirical data. This was based on sort of wildlife managers taking estimates of the turkeys in their region and then adding those estimates together. So I emphasize that was a rough estimate. And then sort of my work comes in today, where I'm working to estimate how many turkeys there are using empirical data, so sort of some more scientifically backed methods, and then also estimating where they are in the province and why, so what sort of resources they're taking advantage of. And there are several interesting reasons to study wild turkeys. The first being that they were hunted to extinction in Ontario, so we have this sort of unique opportunity to study the ways in which this reintroduced population has been able to sort of move throughout the province. Do I incorporate information from mandatory hunter surveys? So I haven't in the work that I am talking about today, but it's definitely something that I've considered, and I can talk a bit more about that at the end. But that's a good question, yeah. Whoops. Okay. And so the ways that I've gone about counting wild turkeys, estimating the number in the province, is by using community science. This is also sometimes termed citizen science, but I prefer to call it community science, since you don't need to be a citizen to participate in projects like this. And so what I did was I circulated a poster that looked a lot like this around the internet, and collected observations from all across the province from individuals submitting those observations to eBird and iNaturalist. Both of these are sort of common species reporting platforms. And this is what the data looked like from that project. So this is all community collected data. So these are volunteer submissions. All the pink or purpley dots on here were submitted through eBird. So we can see that eBird was much more commonly used in this project, sorry. But these yellow ones here are from iNaturalist. So we did still have some sort of unique observations here from our other reporting app. And some interesting observations on this map, interesting for me as a turkey researcher, are the furthest north observations and the furthest south observations, because these tell us about sort of the range limits, the tolerance that the species can have in terms of climate and resource availability. So up here we have wild turkeys in and around Sault Ste. Marie and on St. Joe's Island. And it's important to note that these birds were actually placed here during that trap and transfer effort that I talked about. So they didn't actually migrate or move up from the southern part. They were placed there and they've been able to persist there. And then we also see them down here in Point Pelee. And so this is sort of as far south as they go into the province, but then of course they extend further south into the United States. And so with this information, with these community observations, along with other variables about the habitat, so sort of what type of forest is there, are there agricultural resources available to wild turkeys, temperature, snow depth, lots of different variables. I've been able to come up with a model that predicts where they might be in the province based on sort of the habitat requirements that this species has, and based on where we're seeing them already. And so the darkest red regions here represent very highly suitable wild turkey habitat. And then as we get into the sort of dark blue, we have lower suitability for wild turkeys in the province. Okay, and so with that, I'll move into the sort of year in the life part of my presentation, where I'll talk about a bit more closely about the turkeys that I've studied rather than turkeys more broadly. And I'll talk about sort of their behavior going through winter, spring, summer, and fall. And so in the winter, I like to start talking about wild turkeys in the winter because this is when I started them. I started studying wild turkeys in January of 2017. And so I started this project, and I started studying them during the winter because this is also when we trap them. And I'll talk about why this is in just a couple slides, but I have some trail cam footage. Hopefully this is coming through okay and it's not too choppy. I know sometimes when I give this presentation on Zoom, the videos are a little bit choppy. But in the winter, this is sort of typical wild turkey behavior. So they're clumped up in big groups in large sort of wintering flocks, we call them, and they're typically closely aggregated around these supplemental food sources. So on this trail cam, I have a pile of corn here, and I've set this trail cam up as sort of a way for me to observe the wild turkeys. And so this supplemental food source, I've provided it, but there are lots of supplemental food sources for them throughout the province. They are often seen in close proximity to farms, for instance. They're eating those corn kernels. They're eating soybean out of fields of soy as well. And so in close proximity to lots of these sort of supplemental food sources throughout the province. They are also sometimes seen at bird feeders. They're of course a less common bird feeder species than we're used to seeing, but they do sometimes go up to bird feeders, especially in the winter time when their natural food sources are covered by sort of that deep layer of snow, a bit harder to access since wild turkeys typically access their food by scritching in the soil, and they're eating food resources on the ground. And so during this time of year, they're more likely to be seen at bird feeders as well. This is a bird feeder at a friend of mine's cottage just outside of Peterborough. And then this is a wild turkey at a bird feeder in Toronto. This is actually a relatively famous wild turkey that was living in Christie Pits in Toronto. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the city, but that's a very urban park. And so she was there for quite some time, probably because of supplemental food sources like this, keeping her around. And then also lots of folks feed pigeons in Toronto as well. So I imagine that she was getting some supplemental food that way as well. And so when I go about looking to trap wild turkeys to do my research, what I'm looking for are those tightly clumped groups. So I'm looking for those supplemental food sources that they might be taking advantage of. It's great if I see a group of wild turkeys, but more often what I'm looking for are tracks like this in the snow. And so this gives me sort of a really good hint that the wild turkeys are using this region when you have sort of all these tracks winding through an area. And we like to, of course, trap them where they already are, makes it easier for us. And we don't like to encourage them to move into areas where they're not typically going. We don't want to sort of change their behavioral patterns too much in this trapping work. And so we're also looking for a big open field like this. And you'll see why, I think, in just a couple slides. It has to do with how we trap wild turkeys. But I'm also looking for sort of a big open space for us to use our equipment. So all of these sort of pieces of the puzzle need to come together for us to be able to trap them successfully. And so what I typically do then is I'll make a path through this open field that I found once I know that wild turkeys are using the area. So I've flattened this snow out and made a nice little turkey path here for them. And then I will drop kernels of corn along that path. So turkeys in the winter are very corn motivated, and we use that to our advantage in trapping them. And so what we do is typically put a few kernels sort of every few feet, and we encourage them to move out into the open area in this field. And so this is sort of the jackpot that they're going to find at the end of this path, is this nice pile of corn for them. And so we're encouraging them to sort of come out into this open space and spend time in a nice tightly packed group around this pile of corn. And we do this because of, as I said, the way that we trap them. And so this is a diagram that I've made to sort of show how the net falls on top of the flock that we use. We use something called a rocket net. And so these represent our rockets, or how we fire the net. The net is packed up in this net box on the bottom. It's folded up in a particular way. I'm Wile E. Coyote around the corner with my detonators, typically in the truck, staying warm since we trap them in the winter. And so I'm hiding around the corner, and I'm waiting for the turkeys to make a nice tight group around this pile of corn. And then once they do, that's when I would detonate the net. And it sort of comes out of the net, flies across the field, and then falls on top of the flock. And I have a video of that happening, so I'll play that now. Okay, so that's the rocket net. So that's the rocket net box on the right-hand side of the screen. I'll play that again since it's quick. You'll also notice this bird on the very far right of the screen here has gotten away, so it's his lucky day. There's typically 1 or 2 turkeys that get away when we trap them in a big flock like this, but we're aiming for sort of as many as possible. So I'll play that for you one more time. So the net box is here. And then we have the net fall on top of the flock. And I have another video. So this is a video from my supervisor, Jeff Bowman. He's wearing a GoPro on his helmet. And so after the net detonates, to make sure that the turkeys don't injure themselves in the net, and also to make sure that they don't sort of hop themselves out from under the net, we all jump out of our vehicles and run towards the turkeys as fast as we can. And so that's what you'll see here. He's hopping out of his vehicle after we've detonated the net, and he's running across the field. So you can see the turkeys sort of hopping under the net. They pop under the net, sort of like popcorn, we call them. And again, this is to make sure that they don't injure themselves. It's stressful for them at this time. Of course, something very loud has just happened. And so we want to sort of get them out from under the net, process them as fast as we can. So we're all moving very quickly, but calmly at this time to make sure that the birds are going to do okay. So you can see them hopping around. There's me coming in. And so we just sort of tangle them in the net a little bit more than they already are. And this keeps them from injuring themselves in the net and also from getting away. And then once we have them out from under the net, we put them in these individual boxes. The boxes are actually designed by the National Wild Turkey Federation in the US. And so they're perfect turkey size. They've got beautiful air holes for the turkeys. And so what we do after that is we'll take them out one by one. You'll notice I have a black sock in my hand here, and I'm about to put this sock over the turkey's head. And this sort of takes away some of that overwhelming stimulation for them. It makes it so they can't see us. They're a little bit more calm this way. And they don't sort of see freedom. And so they spend less time trying to get away from us. So it actually calms them down quite a bit when they're not able to see what's happening. And so we put a sock on their heads, and then we take various measurements from them. So here, what I'm doing is I'm measuring the tarsus, which is the turkey leg, the bottom of the turkey leg. We also take weight measurements. We'll sex them, so whether it's a male or a female, overall body condition, and then we also fit them with little GPS trackers, which is sort of the most interesting part, I think. Putting these GPS tags on them and then getting to observe where they go in their habitat and how they use the space. And so that's what these GPS trackers look like here. So the turkeys wear them sort of like a backpack over each of their wings. And it sits kind of between their shoulder blades there. And they all have a unique ID number and unique frequency. So using a transmitter, I'm able to sort of hear the different frequencies using an antenna, and I can figure out where they've gone and who they're spending time with. and sort of determine from there how they're using their habitat and why. It's also attached with a bungee here. So this is quite stretchy, but we make sure that it's sort of tight enough that they're not going to be able to wiggle out of it, but of course not too tight that it's going to restrict with flight or anything like that. And then they also get some jewelry on their ankles. So each of our turkeys gets one metal band and then one color band. And this is, again, another sort of ID feature for us. So even if they wiggle out of their tag or the battery dies early than we thought it might, when we're putting this sort of equipment on wild animals, there's all sorts of unexpected things that can happen to the equipment out there. And so we have a few different ways to ID each of the birds. And so this way, with these leg bands, we can identify them from a distance using binoculars without any equipment. And then once we've taken all of the measurements that we need to from these birds, we have fitted them with our GPS trackers and their leg bands, then we release them all together as a group. And so we catch them together, process them separately. So once we're done processing one, we put them back in the box, and then we release them together as a flock at the end. And this, again, is a way for us to reduce stress for the birds. Releasing them individually increases their stress because in the winter, they are typically in these larger groups. And so we like to release them in a group as well. So I have a video here. This is my colleague Lizzie on the far left. And so she's counting everyone down to make sure they're all released at the same time. And you'll notice the bird in the very middle is facing the wrong way. And there's always one that sort of doesn't realize that he's free yet. And so you'll see that the bird in the middle takes a little bit longer to realize that he has freedom at the end of the day. There he goes. And so that's exactly what we like to see at the end of the day. We want to see them getting away from us as fast as possible. We want to see that they can still fly. The tags are not interfering with them in any way. And yeah, we want to see that they're sort of leaving the area as fast as possible. We haven't interfered with their ability to get away from predators or anything like that. Here's another photo. So in this one, we can see the GPS tracker on his back here. So it's sitting, as I said, just between the shoulder blades, and then we can see the antenna here. And each of them, as I said, have a unique frequency, unique radio frequency that helps us identify them. And here we have her flying. So again, we can see the tag on the back here nicely, not interfering with her flight. And the leg bands here as well. And so the GPS trackers provide us with some incredibly valuable information. They sort of show us the turkey's secrets in a way. I like to joke that I feel like a turkey private investigator sometimes. Sometimes I'm out there following them around and trying to figure out what they're doing and why and who they're spending time with. And so the GPS trackers provide us with sort of even more information because we can't, of course, follow them all around all the time. And so each of these turquoise dots on this map here represents an instance of that turkey sort of being in this location. And we can program the tags to take these GPS fixes at different intervals. So I typically program them to take a fix every 4 hours. I found that this is a nice way to balance the battery life in the tags with the information that we're getting, but we could increase that to every 5 minutes if we were interested in sort of very fine scale movements, or once a day if we wanted the battery to last much longer. But as I said, I typically work with a 4-hour schedule. So each of these turquoise dots here represents an instance where that turkey was. And with this information, we can estimate things like home range size. So that's what this plot here on the right is showing us, where the turkey is using the space and how often. So we can map this as sort of a heat map with different colors representing different amounts of time spent in one area. So this darker pink here gives us a clue that the turkey is spending a lot of time in this one particular area. Perhaps there's a really important food resource there, for instance. So we can learn a lot from these GPS fixes and where they are in the landscape. We can also make maps like this. So I've showed you static maps, but we can also make these sort of movement maps that show us how the turkey is moving through the space. And so this is sort of a more animated way for us to view the data. So this is bird 18. This is a male that I trapped in 2017. He was an adult male when I trapped him, probably about 3 or 4 years old. And he is spending a lot of time in this particular area because that's where his favorite bird feeder is. And so this is GPS fixes taken during the winter, soon after we released him. And so, as I said, those natural food sources are a bit harder to access during the winter. And so they're typically spending time closer to supplemental food sources, in this case, a bird feeder. And then on the right, I have a female bird 38. This is a hen that I trapped during the winter of 2017, and we see similar movements. So she's in a different area. She's down the street from bird 18, but again, she's not moving very far. She's going back and forth across the road between her favorite roost on the left here. She roosts in a cedar lot, and then she's going across the road to a farm on the right-hand side of the road. So she's accessing those supplemental food sources at the farm where there are cows. Okay, and then the next sort of season that I want to talk about naturally is spring. And spring is probably my favorite time to study wild turkeys because it's when they're nesting. And so it's sort of this exciting opportunity to see the birds that you've been tracking for most of the year now reproduce and raise young. Oops. And so here we have wild turkeys doing their turkey thing in the spring. This is the same camera setup that I had before. So I've got some corn here, encouraging them to spend time here. And we see 2 males courting a hen. And so they've got that beautiful tail display. You could hear some gobbling in the background, perhaps. They're puffed up. And they're trying to entice her to mate with them. And typically when we see multiple males displaying like this in wild turkeys, they're often siblings. So they're typically sibling brothers that are courting a female together. And the reason that they do this is because in the turkey sort of mating system, there's typically one dominant male that mates with most of the females in the population. And so if you are not that dominant male, your mating success is likely to be quite low. And so the next best thing is to help your brother mate, since he shares some of the genetic information that you have. Some funny gobbling at the end. I'll play that again for you. And so they work together in this way because it's beneficial for that individual then, that individual that's not sort of the most dominant turkey in the population. It's beneficial for him to help his brother mate because then sort of some of his genetic information is still being passed on to that next generation, even if he's not mating himself. So often when you see pairs, or you sometimes see even 3 or 4 males displaying together in an open field, they're typically sibling brothers that are doing that. Okay. And so the second reason why I think that wild turkeys are an important species to study, particularly in Ontario and other places where they're harvested, is that they are a harvested game species. And so they sort of have this history in the province of being accidentally hunted to extinction and then reintroduced. And they're harvested again today. And so it's important to understand sort of how this population might be growing or changing over time to help us make sure that we're not anywhere close to accidentally over harvesting them again. And this is a point that I bring up sort of during the spring portion of the presentation, because it's in the spring that they are most commonly harvested. There are some wildlife management units in Ontario that also have an autumn hunt, but for the most part, it is during the spring. And then of course, during the spring, they're also nesting. And so here I have 2 aerial photos. So these are photos that I took just standing right above the nest. And we can see some diversity in the habitat that they select, which I find very interesting about this species. So when you read about turkeys, most of the literature says that they will nest in tall grass. And in my experience, that is true. So on the left here, this is a sort of very typical wild turkey nest that we would see, lots of cover. So she's sort of laid her eggs and then nestled them underneath some of this dried grass here. But we also saw turkey nests in other interesting places, like this young cedar forest. So this nest had almost no cover, so super visible. We found it just as we were walking right up to it, whereas often they're tricky to find for us. But this hen was successful, so she was able to sort of keep these eggs protected and incubated and successfully hide from predators for the full incubation period. So they have sort of funny nesting habits, and that sometimes they'll nest in unpredictable places, but often they're successful even in these sort of unconventional places. These are photos of two nests that were not successful. So sometimes we would go up to the nests and find some cracked eggshells. We can tell that it's been predated instead of hatched because of how the eggs appear. So when the turkeys hatch out of their eggs, the top of the eggs typically pop off and they're in two halves. Whereas when a predator gets the nest, there's typically maybe just one hole broken into the side of the egg like we see here or on this side. And so sometimes the nests are predated. I often joke that wild turkey hens in the summertime and the spring summer are food sitting on food because lots of animals like to eat wild turkeys in Ontario, species like coyotes, for instance, larger birds of prey as well. And then lots and lots of species, of course, will eat eggs because eggs are just such a great food source for lots of different animals and easy to obtain, of course. Wild turkeys are also sort of funny in that they'll sort of sit and hide until the very last minute, and then they'll pop up off their nest and run away. And so they don't have sort of an inherent defense mechanism to predators coming up to their nests. So they are quite susceptible to different predators. And so coyotes will eat adults. Coyotes will also go after wild turkey nests, since, as I said, this is such a great food source for them. Raccoons, of course, foxes, lots of species will go after wild turkey eggs in Ontario. And then in the spring, I have another movement map here. So these are the same two individuals, bird 18, a male on the left, and then bird 38, a female on the right. And we can see, in contrast to their movements during the winter, there's quite a lot more movement. That's because the deep snow has melted, and so they're able to physically move through the landscape a little bit easier now. And they're also able to access those natural food sources, so they're not so reliant on staying super close to those supplemental food sources. And so there's lots more movement from both males and females during this time. Males are also moving around the landscape courting females, looking for mates, and then females will be moving around the landscape looking for a good nesting spot. Okay, and here's some other photos to highlight sort of how good they can be at hiding their nests from us. So this is what this nest looks like from above. Can hardly tell that there's a nest here at all. But once we look a little bit lower, we found these wild turkey eggs here from one of our hens. And so often they're quite well hidden. And the only way that we're able to find these nests is by looking at maps like this. Sometimes we can find them by listening, but often we also need to look at their GPS points to see clusters of points like this. So we're looking at sort of really tight clusters of points. And this indicates to us that she's spending a lot of time in one very small geographic area. And so she's likely laying and then incubating, since wild turkey hens will incubate for approximately 28 days. And so once we start to see a tight cluster of points like this, with a female bird, it's a hint to us that she's likely sitting on a nest. And this is sort of what helps us find it in the landscape. This is a nest from bird 38. So that hen that I've been showing you the movements of, this was her first nest that I was able to follow. She may have had nests prior to this, but after I tagged her, this was sort of the first nest that I was able to see. And so you can see here, these are incredibly tall thistles. I've never seen thistles as tall as this. And so she picked a very good spot in terms of protecting her nest from predators and protecting her nest from me, because I had to wear lots of layers and boots and lots of protection to get in here and not get too scratched up. This stand of thistle was also surrounded by an electric fence, since she nested in the middle of a cow pasture. And so this area was sort of fenced off to protect the cows from the thistle. And so she picked an almost perfect spot for her wild turkey nest here. And this is what her nest looked like, deep in the thistles. Okay, and so that brings me to talking about wild turkeys in the summer. And so during the summer now, most of the poults have hatched out of their eggs. There's some late nesting, especially if hens have their first nest predated by a predator, then they'll often try again if there's enough time in the season. So you can definitely see turkey nests later into the summer, but more often what we see are the poults growing and getting a little bit bigger into the summer months. And so during the summer, once the eggs have hatched, once the poults have hatched out of the eggs, they really only spend a couple of days at the nest site after that. Part of the reason that this is because the nest site actually gets really smelly. You can imagine the hen is sitting there for 28 days pretty much straight. She'll leave to get sort of a snack and some water, but she is incubating almost the entire time. And so she's got a lot of waste in the area. The eggs themselves are smelly. And so this becomes a site that can attract lots of different predators. And so once those poults hatch out of the eggs, they move away from that area quite quickly. And then once they've moved away, and I'm sure that I'm not going to disturb the nest in any way, then I'll go in and I will collect the eggshell fragments. So I'll collect all of these different pieces of eggshells and I separate them individually into plastic bags like this. And then I give them each sort of unique identifiers. And the reason that I do this, the reason that I'm interested in collecting their eggshell fragments is for two reasons. So the first is that because wild turkeys are a non-monogamous species, we may see some sort of interesting genetic patterns here. So female turkeys will typically mate with more than one male in a season, and then male turkeys will typically mate with more than one female in a season. And this is a way for both of those sexes to sort of hedge their bets and make sure that even if they mate with an individual with maybe poor quality genetics, or if a male mates with a hen who's immediately eaten by a coyote, he has sort of other chances to pass on his genetic information. And so because wild turkeys are non-monogamous, we might see in one nest eggs from more than one father. Wild turkeys also do something called conspecific brood parasitism, which is really just a fancy term for they will lay their eggs in one another's nests. And so wild turkeys will sort of sneak up to another hen's nest, lay an egg or two. Sometimes they will do this in addition to having their own nests, and sometimes they will only do this. It just depends on the region. Not much is known about wild turkeys and this behavior of conspecific brood parasitism, which is especially why I'm interested in studying it in Ontario. So we have some evidence of this happening in California, but otherwise we just sort of have anecdotal evidence of this based on very large clutch sizes. So hens incubating 20 eggs, for instance, that's sort of an indication that other hens have probably been laying eggs in that nest as well, but there's not a lot of genetic evidence of this. And so that's another reason why I'm collecting these eggshell fragments, because with these two behaviors combined, this non-monogamy and then also the conspecific brood parasitism, we could have nests that have eggs from multiple fathers and multiple mothers. And so I'm interested in seeing sort of how often that's happening and why it's happening. And here we have just a photo of poults as they're a little bit older. So these guys are probably a week, maybe a week and a half, can't quite fly yet. So in the beginning of their life, mom is typically roosting at night in a tree on a low branch, and they're roosting on the ground directly below her. But at about 2 weeks, they'll be able to fly and they'll join her up in the tree and they'll roost in the tree at night as well, because it's much safer for them in the tree than on the ground. Okay, and here we have bird 38's movements during the summer. So this is that hen with the nest and the thistles. So during the summertime, now that she's got poults, she's typically moving around the landscape into regions that are going to have high quality food sources for those babies. So turkey poults typically eat a lot of insects, for instance. So she's going to be in fields where there's a lot of access to little bugs for those poults to eat. And so most of her time is spent sort of caring for those poults and bringing them to reliable food sources that they can access. And again, this is her roost in here is the cedar forest. So she's also spending time in that cedar forest during the summer as well. Sometimes turkeys will switch their roost during different times of year. Sometimes they have sort of winter roosts and summer roosts, but a lot of the time they're roosting in the same place throughout the year. And then here we have bird 18's movements during the summer as well. So male turkeys are not involved in parental care in any way. After they mate, they're sort of done with their contribution, and the rest of the summer they spend their time accessing those natural food sources that are available to them. So he's back at his favorite bird feeder here, and he's spending time moving across the road to other natural food sources on this side of the road, which is sort of a big open field and a stream here. So again, he's going to be accessing insects, for instance, different plant parts, seeds, those kinds of food sources. Okay, and then wild turkeys in the autumn. So this is one of the males that we had tagged. We can see his antenna here. This guy's lost both of his leg bands, which happens sometimes. I don't know how. It's a mystery to me how they're able to wiggle out of those leg bands, but they often do, which again is why it's beneficial for us to have sort of more than one way to identify them. So we can see here, luckily, he still has his GPS tracker on him. We can see he also has this long, beautiful beard. And so this is a male turkey trait, and this appears once they are sort of reaching adulthood. So juvenile males will have very short little stumpy beards, and then as the individuals get older, their beard continues to grow. So this is definitely a mature adult male here. And here's another photo of him here. We can also see on his legs, he's got these spurs. It's a little bit hard to see against the gray background, but this is sort of it's made of keratin, and it's sort of like a horn-like structure, and males use this when they interact with one another aggressively for access to females, for instance, during mating season. So they'll sort of spur one another with this structure. And so in the autumn, wild turkeys are moving back sort of closer to those supplemental food sources that they rely on so heavily during the winter. During the fall, you'll often see wild turkeys in cornfields after the corn's been harvested. They're moving through and picking up that waste grain. And so they're accessing sort of all the grain that's been left after the harvest. So this is a very common sight in the fall in Ontario. And then of course in the fall in Ontario, sometimes we have snow, so they're accessing this waste grain through sort of any shallow layers of snow that we would have during the fall as well. And again, I have another trail cam photo here just of them at their supplemental food source. So we have them sort of moving back to these supplemental food sources close to farms, for instance, close to bird feeders, things like that. And in addition to the supplemental food sources I mentioned already, that wild turkeys access natural food sources like insects. They'll eat lots of insects, particularly the poults that are growing. They need that sort of extra protein. Caterpillars are great sources of food for wild turkeys. They're easy to find and easy to digest. Cocoons also, so these caterpillars, once they've pupated, this is also a great food source for wild turkeys. Different plant parts, seed heads, wild grapes. Wild turkeys will definitely eat wild grape as well. And then of course these forest resources. So wild turkeys in Ontario are considered a forest bird. And this is because they often rely on different tree seeds like acorns, beech seeds, for instance, things like that. Okay, and that brings me to the third reason that I think it's important to study wild turkeys, particularly in Ontario. And that's because they're a common and native Ontario species, and therefore they're an intricate part of our native ecosystem. And they were removed for quite some time, of course, reintroduced. But studying their sort of contemporary dynamics with those other native species in the ecosystem is important in understanding sort of the overall health of the ecosystem and predicting the sort of future health of that ecosystem as well. And so just sort of off the top of my head, I've created this very small food web to kind of highlight some of these interactions in the ecosystem. So I mentioned some of those food resources that they're accessing. So they're working to sort of control some of these populations, keep everything in balance. They also provide food sources for species like coyotes and then larger birds of prey. So this is a peregrine falcon. That's a little bit small to go after a wild turkey, but larger species definitely will go after poults and smaller hens, particularly when they're roosting in trees at night, is when they're most vulnerable to those birds of prey. And then these egg resources, of course, provide lots of food for many different species in the landscape. Eggs are a great source of protein for lots of different Ontario mammals. And then this is sort of not a interaction involved with eating necessarily, but wild turkeys roost in trees every night. And so when you have these large flocks of wild turkeys roosting in trees, they're pooping all night and their feathers are falling to the forest floor. And so we have some important interactions with the ecosystem there as well, in sort of introducing nutrients to the forest through their poop and through their feathers, and sort of changing the soil chemistry in that way as well. And so this is also definitely an important interaction between wild turkeys and their environment. Okay, and that's everything that I wanted to talk about today. So I'm happy to address some of those questions that I see have popped up in the chat now. I see one from Jonathan. Is there any evidence for wild turkeys developing trap shyness? So that's a good question. In my experience, it really depends on the individual. I apologize if you can hear the dog barking in the background. It really depends on the individual. So some of the wild turkeys that I've trapped have never come back to the site, not even once. And so those individuals were obviously very bothered by the trapping experience, not something that we love to see. We don't want to interrupt their sort of natural routine in that way, if we can avoid it. But then other individuals will come back to that spot the very next day. So it really depends on the individual, sort of how impacted they are by that trapping experience. How often do you find hens with beards? Yeah, that's another great question. So in around 10% of the population, females will have those beards that males typically have. And I have seen 2 in the flock that I follow. And the flock that I follow is around maybe 30 to 50 individuals, depending on the year. So it's a bit lower than that 10% estimate, but we don't trap the entire group. So there could be more in there, but I've only seen a couple in my sort of time in studying wild turkeys. But I love to see those individuals. It's that sort of individual variation that I find so interesting as well. I've heard that they eat a lot of ticks. Is this true? So I'm not sure if I can sort of quantify if they eat a lot of ticks. They definitely would eat ticks. They move sort of through that tall grass habitat and they're eating insects off of all of those tall grasses and forbs that are in the fields. So they definitely do eat ticks. I'm not sure if they eat them a lot, but one of my sort of next project ideas is to actually look at the stomach contents of wild turkeys to see what they're eating. Because there's also some researchers that believe that wild turkeys may be eating salamanders, particularly in the south of the province, so in and around Point Pelee. And so I'm really interested in sort of figuring out if that's happening and how much it's happening. So maybe we can get at that tick question at the same time. How long do you estimate that adult turkeys who avoid predators can live? That's a great question too. So perhaps maybe between 7 and 10 years in the wild. Longer in captivity for sure, but most wild turkeys are eaten by predators. So very few of them will die of old age. They'll typically be predated. And I've seen a couple die from the elements, but more often they're eaten by coyotes. Do the large winter flocks also roost together? There's a flock near Napanee that can hold that can be larger than 50 birds. Yeah, so yes, they'll definitely roost together. Sometimes a flock like that will roost in 2 or 3 different trees in the same area, but I've seen maybe 25 or 30 birds in a large sugar maple before, so they'll definitely roost together at night, yeah. And it's that sort of safety in numbers. So there's more individuals to help detect predators, for instance, when they're roosting together. Okay, and then I see you mentioned the turkeys rely on corn during the winter. Prior to European settlement, what would have been their winter food? What would have been their winter food primarily been? Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. So it's not something that I've been able to find a lot of information about sort of turkeys pre-settlement. It's even difficult for us to understand their geographic range pre-settlement. We have a little bit of information from the fossil record, but they likely would have relied on sort of scratching through that snow layer, and they may not have made it as far north as they do today. Which again, I would love to have sort of that historical range information from where they were prior to European settlement. But it's likely that they weren't quite as far north, and that the sort of agricultural resources are definitely helping them at that northern latitude where the snow gets so much deeper than in southern Ontario. We put out corn. Is the turkey group the same group of birds from year to year? Yeah. Heather, it probably is the same group of birds from year to year. So the turkeys that I track are using the same resources every year, very predictable movements through the landscape. And then hens, when they bring their poults into the group, those poults sort of join in, and then they also exhibit those same behaviors. And so something else that I would love to study about wild turkeys is how that information is transferred, because we often see sometimes a lot of turnover in the flock. So sometimes it's a large number of new individuals, but they use the space the same way. And so they're typically the offspring from the previous year combined with those individuals from the previous year, all sort of using the space in the same way. And so I think that there's even some evidence of sort of cultural tradition in wild turkeys, but I haven't had time to dig too deep into that yet. But yes, the short answer is yes, it's probably the exact same birds using that food source year after year. Have you compared DNA from extirpated specimens from before the early 1900s with specimens obtained post-reintroduction? Yeah, I'm wondering if there was a specific genotype in Ontario. So we haven't, we just don't have the data. I would love to do that. I think it's a very interesting question. We collect genetic information from all of the individuals that we trap. And so I'm looking at sort of fine scale genetic patterns and sort of how individuals in the flock are related to one another compared to how they're related to other flocks. But we just don't have the same samples from before settlement to compare the genotypes with. But it's a great question, and I would love to do some sort of more broad scale genetic information analysis as well, and collecting sort of DNA samples from individuals all across the province. I think that that's also a very interesting question. We see some get more comfortable with us around, and it's so cute to see them come running out of the woods when they're hungry. Yeah, it is. It's lovely to see when they get sort of excited about that food resource that they're used to having. That's nice that you can sort of have that connection with those same birds year after year. Rom has an extensive collection of turkey specimens. Yeah, so something to look into for sure. One of my lab mates collaborates with museums and has been able to extract DNA from some of those samples. So it's definitely possible, just not within the scope of my project, but something that I would love to look into for sure. When were they introduced? When they were they introduced as flocks? Yep, so when they were introduced, they would have been introduced in groups as well, for the same reason that I talked about sort of trapping them in groups and then releasing them in groups. So their survivorship would be higher in larger flocks. And so definitely in the 80s, when they were reintroduced into the landscape, they would have been reintroduced in sort of small groups. And those flocks probably have changed a lot. Yeah. As I mentioned, the current estimate, or the most recent estimate, was 70,000 individuals from 4,400. So they've expanded their range, and it's likely that they've moved around quite a bit. I am going to publish my turkey work. Yes, so I'm working on publishing a paper now with that map that I showed you, and mapping sort of where they're going in the province and their habitat suitability. That's the work that I'm working on publishing now, but I will be publishing more work on their nest genetics, flock genetics, and then also some flock hierarchy work, since I've looked at sort of how they interact with one another, and if there is a dominant turkey in the flock, if this is the same individual every day, or if it changes. And so I have a few papers in line to publish. Absolutely, yeah. Is there an avian flu concern with them? So avian flu is affecting a lot of different bird species. Yes, it's been detected in a handful of wild turkeys. We swabbed turkeys in Peterborough. We don't have that data back yet from the winter, but I I don't anticipate that many individuals in Peterborough County have been affected by avian flu. They all looked great when we trapped them. And so I don't think that we'll find any positive cases, but they're susceptible to avian flu. So it could become a concern. Absolutely, yeah. What purpose do the hooks on the legs serve the toms? Yeah, so those spurs on their legs, it's typically when they have those sort of aggressive interactions between males during the mating season. So they'll sort of puff themselves up really big, and you'll see them jump at each other and kick. And it's when they're kicking, they're using their spurs to make contact with one another. And it's not super sharp. It's sort of a blunt end, but it definitely still hurts for you to get hit with a turkey's spur. So it's effective in sort of getting that individual away from you. But yeah, it's typically a sort of aggressive interaction that you see those spurs come out.
Well, thanks everyone. This is Jerry again, Jennifer. Hi. That was so interesting and beautifully structured. You have great photographs. You've got some very elegant turkeys in there.
Thank you. I'm glad that you liked it.
Yeah, fascinating, super enjoyable. And you're doing some really interesting research. How much longer do you think your research, will you be able to do this research?
Yeah, so I'm hoping to defend this research in the next year or so. I've been teaching at Trent along with doing my research. I teach a couple university courses, and so that slowed me down a little bit, but I love teaching, so I'm happy to sort of balance both. But yeah, I'm hoping to defend in the next year and then get that work published as well.
Well, thank you very much on behalf of all of us. And we've been recording you, as you know, and I will certainly be dipping in again because I enjoyed it so much. We will have a gift for you and we will get it to Peterborough. So thank you again. And I'm going to hand over to Amy now.
Thank you so much.
I have to unmute. I'm going to stop the recording. Okay, stop cloud. Okay, no, still recording. Stop cloud recording.